My name is Ruth Calloway, and I am 63 years old. I have lived long enough to know that the moments which change everything rarely arrive with any warning. They don't come dressed in drama or announced with raised voices. Sometimes they come quietly in the middle of a celebration, while people are smiling, while music plays softly in the background, and while someone is simply trying to take a photograph. That is exactly how it happened to me. My son Daniel and his wife Serena had spent nearly a year restoring an old Victorian home in the historic district of Charleston, South Carolina. The bones of the place were beautiful, tall ceilings, wide wraparound porches, original hardwood floors that creaked in just the right places. When the renovation was finally complete, they threw a housewarming party and invited everyone who mattered to them. Family, old friends, neighbors, colleagues. The courtyard behind the house was strung with warm lights. Someone had set out trays of food on long tables covered with white linen. A guitarist played quietly near the garden wall. It was the kind of evening that looks perfect in photographs. I had helped make that evening possible, not just by showing up, not just by celebrating. I had contributed $200,000 toward the down payment on that house. I had spent weekends there during the renovation, keeping Daniel and Serena's young daughter Lily occupied while contractors moved through the rooms. I had brought meals, held ladders, offered opinions only when asked, and stayed out of the way when I wasn't needed. I had done what mothers do quietly, without expecting applause. But none of that seemed to matter when the photographer gathered everyone near the back steps. It was a simple moment. Someone suggested a group photo before the evening wound down. People shuffled into position, laughing and adjusting, the way people do when nobody really wants to stand still. I moved beside Daniel, close enough that our shoulders nearly touched. I smiled the way I always do in photographs, not a forced smile, just a quiet and genuine one. And then Serena stopped everything. She stood at the edge of the group, studying the arrangement with the focused expression she always wore when something wasn't meeting her standards. Her eyes moved slowly across the assembled faces. Then they landed on me. "Ruth," she said. Her voice was calm, almost pleasant. "Do you mind stepping out? You're throwing off the aesthetic." The courtyard went completely silent. Not the kind of silence that lasts only a second. The kind that stretches. The kind where you can hear the guitarist fumble a note and recover. The kind where everyone suddenly finds something very interesting to look at on the ground. A woman near the edge of the group let out a short, uncomfortable sound that was almost a laugh, but wasn't quite. Someone behind me murmured, "I think there's room for everyone." Serena didn't look at them. She tilted her head slightly, as if explaining something obvious to someone slow to understand. "It'll photograph better with fewer people. Cleaner lines. It's not personal." The photographer lowered his phone. He looked at Daniel, and I looked at Daniel too. I want you to understand what that moment felt like, standing in the warm glow of those string lights, surrounded by people I had known for years, looking at my son and waiting. Just waiting. For something simple. A word. A sentence. Even a look that said, "I'm sorry. Let me handle this." Daniel shifted his weight from one foot to the other. He rubbed the back of his neck, a habit he's had since he was a teenager, something he did when he felt trapped between two things and didn't want to choose either one. "Mom," he said quietly, "it's just one photo." 5 words. And in those 5 words, everything became very clear. I nodded. I don't know why I nodded, some instinct toward politeness, maybe, or simply the muscle memory of keeping peace in difficult moments. Then I stepped out of the frame. The group shifted slightly, closing the space where I had been standing as naturally as water filling a gap. The photographer raised his phone again. Someone laughed at something. The moment sealed over itself like it had never happened. I walked past the food tables, past the guitarist, through the courtyard gate, across the quiet street, and I got into my car. I didn't cry on the drive home. I'm not entirely sure why. There was something sitting in my chest that was heavier than sadness and quieter than anger. It was the particular weight of clarity arriving all at once, the feeling of finally seeing something you had been carefully not looking at for a very long time. I should tell you that what happened in that courtyard did not begin on the night of the housewarming. It only became visible there, the way a crack in a wall is sometimes invisible until the right light hits it at exactly the right angle. When Daniel first brought Serena home to meet me, I was genuinely happy for him. She was confident, articulate, and clearly talented. She had strong opinions about design and aesthetics, the way spaces should feel, the way light should move through rooms, the way objects should be arranged to create a sense of intention. I admired that about her. I told myself that strong women with clear visions are exactly the kind of people worth admiring. The first time she commented on my home, I let it pass without much thought. We were sitting in my living room. She looked around at my bookshelves, at the collection of things I had gathered over 30 years of a life fully lived, the antique clock my mother left me, the framed photographs, the small ceramic pieces I'd collected from travels, the furniture that was old and comfortable and mine. "It's cozy," she said, in a tone that did not quite mean cozy. "Older decorating styles can feel a little busy," she added lightly, "but it suits you." I smiled and offered her more tea. Looking back now, I recognize that moment for what it was, not a comment about furniture at all, but a small preliminary measurement. Serena was someone who needed to know where the edges were, and I, in my eagerness to make her feel welcome, had shown her that my edges were very easy to move. Over the years that followed, that pattern quietly repeated itself, always with pleasant words, always framed as practicality or aesthetics or simple preference, but the direction of it never changed. My opinions mattered slightly less each time. My presence was welcomed when it was useful and overlooked when it wasn't. The balance shifted so gradually that it was almost impossible to name the exact moment when I stopped feeling like a parent and started feeling like a convenience. The house near the historic district was the clearest version of that pattern. I remember the evening Daniel came to see me with a folder of papers. He sat across from me at the kitchen table, and Serena sat beside him, composed and certain the way she always was when she had already decided how a conversation would end. "We found a place," Daniel said. "It's perfect, but we're short on the down payment." He told me the number. Serena smiled. "It's really an investment. The structure is extraordinary. Once the renovation is complete, the value will increase significantly." She paused just long enough. "You'd be helping them build something that will last." I agreed. I took time to think it over, but in the end, I agreed. Because Daniel was my son, and because I had money I had spent 30 years carefully saving, and because I believed that family means helping when you can. What I didn't fully account for was that the help would be accepted without the helper ever being fully welcomed. During the renovation, I was present almost every weekend. I watched Lily when workers were moving through the rooms. I brought lunches. I held things in place while Serena directed and Daniel followed. She thanked me regularly. The words were always correct, but there was a texture to them, a professional courtesy, like thanking a housekeeper for a job well done. Occasionally, Daniel would glance at me during these moments with something in his expression that I couldn't quite read. Not guilt, exactly. More like someone who has convinced themselves that everything is fine and needs the people around them to agree. I agreed, for longer than I should have. The night after the party, I sat at my kitchen table until well past midnight. My phone had lit up twice with messages from a woman named Claire, a friend of Serena's who had been at the gathering. She seemed to feel, in the way some people do, that delivering uncomfortable news was a form of kindness. "She's still crying," her first message read. I stared at that for a long time. Then I wrote back, "What happened after I left?" Claire's response came quickly, as if she had been waiting. She told me that the mood had shifted after I walked out, that the photographer had taken the picture, but nobody seemed particularly interested in looking at it, that a few of the guests had said something to Daniel quietly, carefully, the way people do when they're uncomfortable but don't want to make a scene, that Serena had overheard some of it, that she had retreated to the kitchen and begun crying. "Did she say anything about what she said to me?" I asked. The pause before Claire's reply was long enough that I almost set the phone down. "Not really," she finally wrote. She said people were making her look bad. I read that sentence twice, then a third time. There is a particular kind of crying that comes from remorse, from genuinely understanding that you hurt someone and wishing you hadn't. And there is a different kind of crying that comes from the discomfort of being seen. Serena's tears, from everything Claire described, were the second kind. She wasn't devastated because she had wounded me. She was distressed because other people had witnessed it and formed opinions she hadn't controlled. Those are not the same thing, and recognizing the difference turned out to matter enormously. I didn't call Daniel that week. I didn't call the week after either. What I did instead was something much quieter, and in some ways much more significant. I simply stopped doing what I had always done. The following Saturday morning, Serena called at 9 o'clock. Her voice carried the easy assumption of someone who expects an arrangement to continue because it always has. "Are you still coming at 10? We have plans in the afternoon." I took a slow breath. "I can't make it today," I said. "I have other plans." The silence that followed lasted a beat too long. "We were counting on you, Ruth. I understand," I said. "But today doesn't work for me." She ended the call with minimal warmth. 3 days later, Daniel called in the evening. His voice had the careful, measured tone he used when he was trying not to sound upset about something he was absolutely upset about. "Vanessa said you canceled on Saturday." "I wasn't available," I said. "That's not quite the same thing." "Mom, you're always available." "I used to make that choice," I said calmly. "I've made a different choice now." Another silence. He said he'd call me soon. He didn't, for another week. When he called again, it was about money. A contractor had discovered an electrical problem behind the walls of the third-floor renovation. The estimate was significant. "We're short," Daniel said. "We were hoping you might be able to help again." "I won't be able to," I said. "What?" His voice sharpened slightly at the edges. "Mom, you helped before." "Yes," I said, "and I'm glad I did. But that help had a cost that I don't think anyone fully acknowledged, and I'm not in a position to continue." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "This is about the party, isn't it?" "It's about a number of things," I said. "The party was simply the moment I stopped pretending I hadn't been noticing them. You're making this into something it wasn't." I let that sit in the air between us for a second or two. "Daniel," I said gently, "did you ever tell Serena that what she said to me was wrong?" The silence that followed was different from the others. It was the silence of someone who had been asked a question they knew the answer to and couldn't find a way to say it. "It wasn't meant to be." "That's not what I asked," I said quietly. He didn't answer. The call ended shortly after, politely, carefully, without resolution. I set the phone down and sat in the quiet of my kitchen. I noticed something unexpected. The silence, which had always felt like absence, now felt like space. Like room to breathe that I hadn't realized I'd been missing. In the months that followed, I heard things in the way you do when you belong to a community through neighbors, through mutual friends, through the gentle social circulation of a city like Charleston. I heard that the childcare arrangements had become complicated, that a professional nanny cost considerably more than anyone had anticipated, that the electrical work had delayed the completion of the third floor, that Serena had returned to work earlier than she'd planned because the finances required it. None of these things made me glad. That would have required wanting them to suffer, and I didn't. What I felt instead was something more precise than satisfaction. It was the particular clarity that arrives when you stop absorbing weight that doesn't belong to you and watch it settle back onto the people meant to carry it. Daniel came to see me one afternoon without calling first. He sat in the same chair he always sat in, across the kitchen table from me, and for a long moment neither of us said anything. "Things are hard at the house," he said eventually. "I imagine they are," I said. "People are still talking about the party." He looked tired in the way people do when they've been managing something uncomfortable for too long. "Serena feels like everyone turned on her." "I understand that," I said carefully. "Being seen doing something unkind is difficult." "She didn't mean it the way it came out." "Daniel," I said his name gently, "the way I used to when he was small and I needed him to pay attention. I'm going to ask you something, and I'd like an honest answer. In all the time since the party, have you ever told her, plainly, that what she said to me was wrong?" He looked at the table. He looked at his hands. He looked at a spot on the wall just past my shoulder. "It's complicated," he said at last. "I know it is," I said. "I've watched it be complicated for years, but the complication has always been arranged so that I absorbed the difficulty and you two remained comfortable. I don't think that's the right arrangement anymore." He stood up after a while and moved toward the door. At the threshold, he turned back. "I just want things to go back to normal," he said. I looked at my son, this person I had raised, had fed, had walked through every grief with, had helped buy a house, and I felt a complicated tenderness for him alongside something that was no longer willing to bend. Sometimes normal evolves, I said. And sometimes what we called normal wasn't really fair to begin with. He nodded once. Then he walked to his car. I watched him drive away from the front window, and I stayed there for a long moment after he disappeared around the corner. I thought about the boy who used to reach for my hand at busy intersections, who once wrote, in careful handwriting, that his mother was the strongest person he knew. I was still that person. He had simply forgotten to look. Several months after that conversation, I went to a small afternoon gathering near the waterfront, a simple picnic with people who had known me for years and didn't need anything from me except my company. We were finishing lunch when my friend Linda stood up with her phone. "Before everyone leaves," she said, "let's get a picture." People shifted toward each other without ceremony. Linda waved me over. "Ruth, come stand here, right in the middle." I stepped into the space she indicated. The group closed warmly around me. "Is this all right?" I asked. Not because I needed permission, but because the question surfaced from somewhere old in me. Linda laughed. "Of course it is. You're exactly where you should be." The photographer didn't study the arrangement. Nobody measured the frame. Nobody weighed whether my presence improved or detracted from the composition. Linda simply raised her phone, said everyone smile, and captured the moment exactly as it was. Later that evening, I looked at that photograph for a long time. I wasn't positioned at the center because I'd negotiated a place there. I was there because the people around me wanted me there. The difference between those two things, I realized, is the entire difference. Daniel called a few weeks later. His voice was quieter than usual. "Serena thinks we should all sit down together," he said. "Try to work through things." "I'm open to that," I said. "When everyone is ready to have an honest conversation about what happened and what needs to change, I'll be there." "And until then?" "Until then," I said, "I'll be living my life." There was a pause. "I love you, Mom," he said. It came out a little roughly, like something he'd been holding for a while. "I love you too," I said. "That's exactly why this matters." After the call ended, I sat for a moment in the evening quiet of my home. The antique clock on the shelf ticked steadily. The bookshelves stood exactly as they always had, full of things collected over a long and fully inhabited life. And I thought about something I wish I had understood much earlier. For most of my years, I believed that keeping peace meant remaining wherever someone else had positioned me, even when that position kept shrinking, even when the frame kept getting smaller, even when being included required me to make myself less. What I know now is different. You do not negotiate your place in the lives of people who love you. Love does not require that kind of arithmetic. And when someone asks you to step out of the picture, whether with words or with silence, or with the slow accumulation of 1,000 small dismissals, the most honest thing you can do is understand that the picture they are composing may not be the one you belong in. The photograph with Linda sits on my kitchen table now. 11 people, no particular arrangement, no aesthetic calculation, just people who were glad to be in the same frame. It is, without question, the most beautiful picture taken of me in years. If you have ever found yourself slowly disappearing from your own story, step back in, not loudly, not with anger, simply with the quiet, unshakable conviction that your presence has always been worth keeping.